The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective.
In our first story today, we look at how back to school overburdens families with extreme costs. In August, this is the month that marks the start of school for most states across the U.S. For many families, that means digging deep into their pockets again. The starting list is long, especially when children are starting school for the first time. Notebooks, pens, book bags, binders, rulers, lunchboxes, and so much more. According to recent data, it's especially worthwhile to look at the burden of these costs. A typical assortment of first-day school supplies is costing families as much as 7.3% more than last year. Price increases for supplies like index cards have jumped more than 40%. Binders and folders see an increase of 13%. Families with children in elementary through high school are expected to spend an average of $890 on school supplies, a significant increase from previous years according to the National Retail Federation. College students and their families are expected to spend even more, with average spending surpassing $1,200. Parents are also now expected to pay up to $163 more to pack their child's lunch than last year. All these costs do not even begin to approach the rising costs for transportation, technology, clothes, and so much more, which are all markets that are significantly affected by Trump's tariffs, all that hoist the costs on working families. Anyone who thinks these are just luxury items overlooks the fact the differences add up, even in the little things. Working families are forced to break the bank. They're called to the registers with targeted advertising of back-to-school supplies by retailers trying to undercut each other with so-called special offers. However, the reality of this all confirms that the price in this system is not an expression of actual value, but of a sales strategy. Public schools are often touted as places of equal opportunity, while the material prerequisites for this remain outsourced to retailers. When retailers can offer the same glue stick for twice the price, it's not a whim of the market. The difference between $60 and $100 for an inexpensive backpack may seem modest on paper, but combined with notebooks, pens, folders, sports equipment, and all the other little things, it reproduces the silent selection that makes children from working households realize on their very first day of school that equality is impossible under capitalism. The recommendation to wait because promotions or discounts become more, likely closer to the deadline, is sensible, but at the same time is cynical. Those who are short on cash need to postpone the purchase so they can then win the discount war. A society that takes access to education seriously would not delegate the problem to a checkout line, but would organize demand collectively. Under socialism, school districts could centrally procure basic equipment and distribute it to students. Schools could provide standardized, pedagogically sound starter kits that don't rely on brands or logos. The government, that is, the worker state, could ensure distribution of basic necessities and essential school supplies instead of keeping families busy with comparing prices on websites and TV. But as long as capitalist politicians view the ritual of the start of school as an economic stimulus package for retailers, the moral appeal to parents and the coercion of families to compare prices, wait for promotions, and save time all remain the polite sham of a distribution conflict in which learning materials are privately financed and corporations revel in the profits. Education doesn't begin at the checkout, but that's frequently where it fails. In other national news, a grand bargain for the spoils of the imperialist conflict between the US, NATO, EU, and Russia in Ukraine, as well as other fronts of the global geopolitical confrontation, took place on Friday, August 15th in Anchorage, Alaska, at the American Elmendorf Air Base between the US and Russian delegations led by Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Ultimately, the summit between the two leaders did not result in any concrete agreements or ceasefires, and all the summit statements about peace and ceasefire are still just that, statements while the war continues. The Trump-Putin meeting was part of imperialist bargaining based not on the interest of the peoples, that is, the Ukrainian and Russian people who are paying the price of this war, but on the interest of the US and Russian monopolies, the expansion of their business activities, and the increase in their profits. Under the title of so-called pursuing peace for the supposed resolution of the crisis in Ukraine, the meeting concluded after 2 hours and 45 minutes with what it ironically labels progress in negotiations. However, the reality is that the conflict in Ukraine continues and is escalating, with both Russia and the US generalizing their war preparations in their respective economies. Any compromise reached is transient and fragile. The US shifts its attention on other parts of the world and hoists the burden of maintaining the compromise and its greater financial costs on the EU. This is why, in the context of these negotiations, the contradictions between the EU and the US, as well as their competing interests, continue to emerge. These imperialist arrangements made between Putin and Trump cannot erase the cause of war, which is generated by the capitalist system. This is especially pronounced at a time when the competition for the precipice in the imperialist system is intensifying. In the words of our comrades of the Communist Party of Greece, the wars, the bargains, and the temporary arrangements of the bourgeois classes are ultimately paid for by the people with rivers of blood, but also with economic sacrifices, such as the 800 billion euros that are burdened on the backs of the peoples of Europe for the needs of the war economy and their preparations. In the United States, the workers and people must continue our struggle against the false expectations and illusions that are cultivated by the mouthpieces of capitalism. It is our duty to strengthen the struggle against the imperialist war, for the removal of the U.S. military bases across the globe, for the canceling of all imperialist treaties, for the withdrawing of all financial, military, and political support for the genocidal state of Israel, as well as the policies of the Republican and Democrat governments that are at the forefront of all of these criminal activities.
We'll be right back with more of New Worker News here on 92.9 FM WZML. But I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. So we at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. Only through militant organization of the working class can we stand toe-to-toe against the bosses. So this is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? Bosses cutting your hours or wages? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out of the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? Well, you are not alone. So reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com. And check us out online at newworker.us. And now back to New Worker Radio, only here on 92.9 FM WZML.
In more national news, a few days after the summit with Putin, a meeting between Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky was held on Monday, August 18th, with the presence of European leaders, in the context of the imperialist powers bargaining for the profits they will gain from the war in Ukraine and in their competition with Russia. The meeting was attended by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, the presidents of France and Finland, Macron and Stubb, the prime ministers of Italy and the United Kingdom, the far-right Giorgia Meloni and the Social Democrat Keir Starmer, as well as NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Before the meeting, they answered questions from reporters where they indulged in hypocritical statements about achieving peace and security. Of course, Trump did not miss a beat in presenting himself as the harbinger of peace, saying that he would work with both Ukraine and Russia, with everyone, to ensure that peace will be so-called long-lasting. Before beginning their meeting in the Oval Office, the issues that were expressed in the issued joint statements, without exception, expressed their wishes for so-called peace and a ceasefire in the imperialist slaughterhouse in Ukraine that they themselves have ignited by supplying the Zelensky regime with money and weapons. They called in all tones for security guarantees to be provided to Ukraine, also making references to NATO Article 5. Ukraine is proposing that it should be allowed to buy weapons from the United States worth $100 billion and drones worth $50 billion, financed by Europe. In return, it is demanding security guarantees from the United States. These security guarantees, the meaning of which has not yet been revealed, seems to be something that the United States and Ukraine agree on, and they are apparently accepted by Russia, at least according to what Trump says. Trump said the U.S. would contribute to the security guarantees, though European countries would bear a larger share of that burden. He added that Putin indicated Russia could accept security guarantees for Ukraine and emphasized that this is one of the key issues the leaders will be discussing during the meeting, essentially determining who will take on which responsibilities. He reiterated his plans to arrange a trilateral meeting with the Ukrainian and Russian presidents. Zelensky, for his part, described his meeting with Trump as constructive and said that Ukraine would be willing to participate in a trilateral meeting with Putin. For his part, Zelensky said he needs everything from the U.S. to ensure Ukraine's security and expressed his support for Trump's plan to end the war diplomatically. Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, also promises that the U.S. arms deliveries to Ukraine will continue. For its part, shortly before the Trump-Zelensky meeting, the Russian Foreign Ministry said it does not see NATO troop deployment in Ukraine as a viable solution and criticized recent UK statements as provocative, arguing they contradict ongoing efforts by Moscow and Washington to reach a comprehensive and stable resolution to the conflict. In other national news, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, plans to terminate its contract with the union representing its 8,000 employees, a further step in Trump's plan to massively weaken collective bargaining in the federal workforce. Unions are preparing legal action. The union, which represents 8,000 EPA workers, plans to file a legal response to the decision. Justin Chen, president of the EPA chapter of the American Federation of Government Employees, said in his statement. This will deprive hundreds of thousands of federal employees of the opportunity to bargain collectively with U.S. agencies. Eliminating collective bargaining agreements would make it easier for agencies to fire or discipline employees, according to lawyers representing federal employees. The order would eliminate collective bargaining rights at more than 30 federal agencies, including the EPA, and is currently being challenged in court by unions who argue that the order violates freedom of expression and the obligation to bargain with employees. According to federal personnel records, the EPA employed more than 16,000 people as of March 2025. This number does not include employees who accepted severance offers. The agency announced in July that it would reduce its workforce by at least 23% and close its scientific research office, part of Trump's broader plan to downsize the federal government. Unions are suing to stop Trump's efforts to abolish collective bargaining agreements. A federal appeals court ruled on August 1st that the government could exempt certain federal agencies from their requirement to negotiate with unions. The union, AFGE, which represents EPA workers, is the plaintiff in the lawsuit. In our final national news story, we look at the deployment of soldiers on the streets of Washington. The deployment of Army and National Guard forces on the streets of the U.S. Capitol began Wednesday, August 13th, following the decision announced Monday by Trump under the pretext of fighting crime and reducing the number of homeless people in public spaces. At some government buildings and federal agencies, soldiers began setting up roadblocks to control the movement of people. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt said earlier that in September, the government would arrest, quote, every violent criminal in the Washington, D.C. area who violates the law, undermines public safety, and endangers law-abiding Americans. In the summer of 2020, President Trump, during his first term, had once again deployed National Guard and Army forces to the streets of Washington under the pretext of stopping riots by members and supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged after the uprising caused by the cold-blooded murder of George Floyd by Minnesota police officers in May of the same year. A full 24 hours after the president's decision to take control of the Washington police and deploy National Guard and Army forces, reports by the Washington Post and the Reuters agency reveal the White House's plans for a possible formation of a new domestic civil disturbance quick reaction force. Against the backdrop of intensifying competition between the two bourgeois parties in the U.S. and the intensity of repression against those who stand up against capitalist exploitation, this new force will be utilized, quote, against social unrest, large mobilizations, or protests. According to the report, in the first phase, the force is planned to consist of approximately 600 soldiers who will be on standby at all times so that they can be deployed in just 1 hour, possibly in 2027 with Pentagon resources. Official documents indicate that they could be divided into 2 groups of 300 soldiers and would be stationed at military bases in Alabama and Arizona, with a scope of application in areas east and west of the Mississippi River, respectively.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML, your home for local, national, and international news, all from a working class perspective. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers Platform. If you're a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that's cwpusa@protonmail.com. If you would like more news from a worker's point of view, visit us at newworker.us. You can find weekly articles on events happening all over the country and internationally. If you've enjoyed the program and wish to see more working class reporting, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML.